Okay, I'm going to begin my introduction, and then as others join, we will keep letting them in. I need to let you all know first that we are recording tonight's Zoom. That's because lots of our members can't join us in person on the night, but it means that they can catch up afterwards because we put these up on our YouTube channel. So just want to remind everybody to make sure you have clothes on, and that if you don't want to be recorded, that you turn your video off. The other thing to let you know is that I am keeping you all on mute for now. It's not that I'm not interested in what you have to say, but it's difficult to hear each other over background noise. So I'm just going to unmute the speakers one at a time while they're doing their thing. And then there'll be opportunity for questions and comments afterwards. And I'll invite you to unmute when it's your turn. To take part in that question and comment section, or to flag anything with me, got a number of options. The reactions button, which for most of you should be the bottom of your screen, allows you to raise your hand. That is the most surefire way of getting my attention because it pops you up to the top of my screen. You can also clap and put your thumbs up and express other emotions using that button if you fancy. And there's also a chat function. You are welcome to send me your question on the chat function. You might not want to say it yourself, but you might want me to ask it on your behalf, for example. And if both of those are failing or you've got any technical difficulties, you can email events@party.coop, where Izzy, hiding behind the big purple bee symbol, will be on hand to help you out. So I think that's everybody in. I will introduce myself. I'm Anna Burley. I've met lots of you before, and it's lovely to see you again. I am the Co-operative Party's Policy Officer, and for some of you, I'll be a familiar face from Wednesday evening Zoom calls through all of our lockdowns. So it's really nice to be back. And we've got two amazing guests today. We have Mary from the Fair Tax Foundation. If you want to give us a wave, Mary. And we also have James Murray MP, one of our newest, but certainly not showing that he's new to the party, one of our newer MPs, representing, is it Ealing, James? Don't want to get this wrong. And sort of has a shadow role looking at tax justice issues. So we're really lucky to be joined by James as well. The order I'm going to go in today is Mary, then James, and then I'll take questions. So if you've got questions for Mary, save them up till we do the Q&A all together at the end, if that's okay. I hope I haven't missed anything. I think I'll probably hand straight over to Mary to introduce a bit about what you're working on. There we go.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. And it's really great to join you to have this opportunity to talk about fair tax. So I'm the networks manager for the Fair Tax Foundation, and we are a social enterprise with a co-op structure. We launched the Fair Tax Mark in 2014, and we're a high bar, which is a high bar accreditation scheme for businesses. I can see somebody here with a Fair Trade Foundation logo, and we sometimes describe ourselves as like Fair Trade, but for tax. And our mission is to encourage and recognise responsible tax conduct. At the moment, the Fair Tax Mark is only for businesses based in the UK, but later this year we'll be launching certification for businesses that are based internationally as well. So we know that tax is kind of right up there as a point of concern about business behaviour. We know that tax avoidance and evasion is still rife. If we look globally, the estimates on tax revenues that are lost to developing countries, they run to hundreds of billions of dollars. Here in the UK, we're likely losing around £7 billion worth every year of corporation tax receipts from multinationals shifting profits overseas. So we campaigners and the media have, done a really great job highlighting the bad guys, like your Amazons, your Googles. But what we want to do is also to highlight and recognise the good guys, to try and level the playing field and make things fair. So kind of a big part of our mission is to actively celebrate responsible businesses and also the role that tax plays in our society. And things are starting to change. We've seen a good step forward just in the past fortnight in the form of the agreement by the G7 leaders to taxing the largest multinationals more fairly. And, you know, regulatory change is really, really important, but it is slow to happen and sometimes frustrating. So voluntary good practice is an important part of how we move forward. So again, kind of our role is to recognise those businesses and organisations that are pioneering responsible tax conduct. And I'm really pleased to say that we have now got over 60 businesses accredited to the Fair Tax mark. Again, so that demonstrates that an organisation is paying the right amount of tax at the right time in the right place. And of course, we are delighted to have the Co-operative Party as one of those. And right from the early days, we had really fantastic support from cooperative businesses, and we now have kind of co-ops large and small on board, mid-counties, co-op groups, SUMA, smaller businesses like one here in Manchester called Unicorn Grocery. And this Fair Tax Week, we have announced another co-op retail society, Chelmsford Star Co-op, to have gained accreditation. And corporation tax really does matter. We see it as a key contribution that any profit-making business makes to society, you know, kind of contributing to all those services and that infrastructure that we all rely on. We've just been celebrating Fair Tax Week. You may have seen it on social media, which is kind of a UK-wide recognition of companies and organisations that pay their fair share of tax, and you know, are proud to be out there kind of promoting responsible tax conduct. And speaking at one of our Fair Tax Week events was Steve Parks from Fair Tax Mark accredited consultancy Convivio, and he kind of described tax and corporation tax. He said, I see it as the greatest crowdfunder ever devised, which I thought was a nice term. You know, and another of our speakers, Nick Shaxson, who's written extensively on tax havens and illicit financial flows, he spoke about the important redistributive effects of corporation tax. You know, with foreign investors now owning kind of over 2/3 of listed shares, it's, you know, it's an opportunity. Corporation tax is an opportunity to ensure that a share of profits made by UK businesses are captured for the public good. And Mary-Ann, we also heard from Mary-Ann Stevenson from the Women's Budget Group, who pointed out that women tend to benefit particularly from the public spending that tax can be used to finance. So I'd just like to rewind to my earlier comment that we've had a good step forward over the past fortnight in the form of the agreement by the G7 leaders. And for anyone who doesn't have the pleasure, like I do, of working on tax for their day job, what's happened is that on the back of proposals put forward by the Biden administration earlier this year, G7 leaders have recently agreed to change how the very largest profitable multinationals are taxed. And there are two strands to this. One is a global minimum tax that's trying to remove the incentive for abuse of tax havens, where, you know, we know corporation tax can be as low as nothing. The original proposal was for this rate to be set at 21%, for those of you that like the numbers. This has since dropped to 15%. The second in the agreement was to tax a portion of profits where sales are made, basically where the real activity takes place, rather than where maybe a business might like to book its profits, where taxes perhaps are low. And we saw France, Germany, Italy and other G7 countries come out in support for these plans really early on, but the UK government was really dragging its heels. Thankfully, things were given a really big push. There was sustained campaigning by tax justice groups, backed up by the Co-operative Party, and the opposition were really good at highlighting the issues. For instance, pushing for the higher 21% minimum rate, not the 15%. So we at the Fair Tax Foundation, we feel that we could come to see this as a historic turning point. And we should also recognise the influence that we can wield as campaigners. Just last week, for instance, we highlighted really quickly when the plans were agreed that they likely wouldn't capture Amazon because of the way that a lot of their operations actually have a really low profit margin, which could potentially escape it. But within 24 hours of flagging this up, we had OECD officials, we had the American administration officials kind of coming out publicly to say that Amazon would be captured. And I think it just shows, the ability to influence is really there. So there's still much to do. We need to see the G7 agreement as the start point. And we know the details going to be thrashed out in coming months. We, along with other tax justice campaigners, have our sights on the G20 summit in Rome this October. So we can see the tide turning. We're no longer seeing this race to the bottom on corporation tax. We're not hearing people talk about the UK becoming a Singapore on Thames. And a big part of what we are out to achieve at the Fair Tax Foundation is to try and change this narrative on tax. Away from tax is a burden, onto tax is something that's a really vital societal investment, and to some extent an environmental one too. We shouldn't let a business off the hook for tax dodging because it's seen to be progressive on the environment. And last week we heard from another speaker at one of our events, Mark Luntley at Co-operative renewable energy developer Energy for All, and he was saying that, we need to see low carbon tech continue to receive enhanced tax reliefs. So, so a role there for tax in supporting the move to zero carbon as well. Before I finish, I just wanted to go from the international stage down to the local one, where perhaps we feel we can have a bit more influence. And talk about our Councils for Fair Tax Declaration, which we launched back in 2019. And we know that tax dodging has got an impact locally. We see the impact on the UK's high streets, which is, in part down to the advantage, the unfair advantages that some multinational online operators enjoy. And we launched the Councils for Fair Tax Declaration on the back of research showing that it was 17.5% of UK national and local public procurement by value in the 5 years to 2019 was won by businesses with connections to tax havens. And we think this is much the highest rate in Europe. Since launching in 2019, 13 councils have now shown significant support for fair tax, which is fantastic. And in Fair Tax Week this year, we've been really delighted to announce Labour-run Birmingham City Council as our 13th council to sign up. So that was really exciting. And, I've got to say the majority of councils to have signed up so far have been as a result of action by cooperative councillors. So, a big thanks for your support. So the Councils for Fair Tax Declaration is about councils doing what they can within the rules to champion responsible tax conduct. When we initially developed the declaration, we and the councils that we were talking to wanted it to be mainly about influencing tax conduct via the procurement process. So we looked into what councils can do, secured a legal opinion, and unfortunately it concluded that kind of the room for manoeuvre is really limited by our current procurement rules. So for instance, a council can't straightforwardly, or a public body can't straightforwardly reward a business for having the fair tax mark. So we're waiting to see what new space might open up following the procurement green paper consultation that took place earlier this year. So the Council's Fair Tax Declaration is about doing what we can now within the rules to take meaningful action. So councils can pass a motion which would see them demonstrate good practice in their own affairs. So this is things like taking action on fake social enterprises which can take unfair advantage of business rates and other reductions. It's about implementing IR35 thoroughly to ensure that contractors are paying their fair share of tax, and also shunning any kind of offshore purchase of land and property. It also commits a council to demanding greater transparency of their suppliers and as a financial due diligence concern, but this is because financial transparency is a really important fair tax consideration. And also where possible, councils commit to where they might own or have a significant control over a business, to encouraging that business to go for Fair Tax Mark certification. We welcome motions from councils of all sizes. We've got parish, we've got district, we've got city, and even if a motion isn't successful, it's still a kind of a really, really important show of support. And if you want more information, I know that Anna or any of Anna's colleagues will be happy to help, especially Emma Hodinart. So to close, there are kind of three things that we think, we say to people you can do to back fair tax. At the moment, it's getting behind the big global tax reforms, which I know that the Co-operative Party are going to be campaigning on, encouraging any businesses that you're connected to go for Fair Tax Mark certification, and also kind of doing the same with your local council via the council's Fair Tax Declaration. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary. And I really love it when we're able to bring the global right down to the impact that people can have in their own high streets and neighbourhoods. So I think really important for everybody to think about what they're going to do as a result of tonight's call. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce James Murray next. James has been doing lots of work with the Co-operative Party on fair tax. And I know has a huge amount to offer the tax justice movement. So I'll hand over to you, James, to talk a bit about some of the work you've been leading.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Anna, and thanks so much for inviting me along here this evening to speak to everyone. And it was really interesting to hear about the work that Mary and her colleagues have been doing on the fair tax campaign, because, I think the idea of fair tax really gets to the heart of a really kind of British value around fairness and about playing by the rules, and how this is a value which is right at the heart of our country. It really means that we're speaking to the whole nation when we're talking about this as a campaign and as a priority, because I think there's nothing that annoys people more than the idea that you pay your own tax and you play by the rules, and then some large multinational through some clever accounting and shifting things overseas gets away without paying their fair share of tax. And I would defy you to walk down any high street in Britain and find people saying that's absolutely fine, Amazon can do what they want and don't have to pay fair tax, because it really gets to the heart of, I think, a value which is at the heart of our country, and also the heart of our party, the Co-op Party and the Labour Party, obviously together working for a fairer country. And so I think in terms of values, it's something which is really well aligned to what is a part of our mission. And I think, what's really interesting for me is that, having done this role as Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury for the last few months, I spend a lot of time on tax. I think Mary said her day job was tax. I feel like, as an MP, you end up having several day jobs where you've got to be a constituency MP, your shadow ministerial role, and then everything else that comes up. So I wish I had, several copies of me to do more, more on everything. But in terms of the tax agenda, there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of detailed statutory instruments that I've got my head around. But this issue, which has now come along around the global minimum corporate tax rate, which has been discussed in the media recently, is one where I think it makes the transition from something which has elements which are very technical and seem remote from people and take a bit of time to explain, with something which really strikes at a value people have, and it strikes a chord with people in popular imagination, which is one reason why, from our point of view, we wanted to push this, because we feel it's something which, yes, we have our heads around the detail, but it's also something which is absolutely at the heart of what people want to see changing about the country and the world. And I think what's really interesting is how the government has reacted to the proposals which have been put forward by President Biden, and to pressure from us in Parliament, from campaigners, from political parties, from the public and journalists and so on. Because I feel like I've been following the government's reaction as it sort of slightly evolved and then backtracked a bit, and then gone in circles and so on over the last few months, because we very first started pushing them on the issue around global minimum corporate tax rate, a few months ago, when we started raising it in Parliament, saying, what are you going to be doing to support an ambitious deal? And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to push the government on this is because, and I don't say this phrase lightly, it really does feel like a once in a generation opportunity. You know, I know that phrase, you've got to be careful when you say that phrase because not everything can be a once in a generation opportunity, but this really is. I sort of think so many years in politics and as a private citizen, just the sense of frustration that these big companies were going to get away with not paying their tax, and it was so hard to do anything about it because you needed international agreement, and if America didn't agree, how would everyone else do it? You know, all of these arguments going around in our heads, and indeed, you know, in Parliament in recent years, ministers have been saying, maybe not entirely, well, with an element of them being a bit disingenuous, but saying, oh, we would, but we need to wait for the rest of the world to act first. We're not going to go it alone. You know, so all of that context is really important. Then President Biden comes along, puts out there that he wants to do a deal. He wants to do it at 21%, which is, you know, an ambitious rate compared to where we've ended up, to be honest. And I think it really is a once in a generation opportunity to get agreement around the world. So we were pushing the government on this to try and make sure they don't let this opportunity slip through their fingers. So where have we got to now? Well, you know, I kept asking for the minister to commit to back an ambitious deal, you know, to explain what the government's position was, and they kept giving us woolly answers where they wouldn't commit to it. And I think what we've seen in the end is that although there has been a global deal announced, and I'm not knocking the fact that that is progress from where we could have been or where we were, I think it's a real shame that it's landed at 15% as a current offer. You know, I very much recognise that the wording is saying at least 15%, so they could raise it to 21% that President Biden suggested. But I think that fall from 21% to 15% is a real shame because it makes a big difference, the effectiveness of the policy. And if you look at it in a few simple terms, you know, the difference between 15 and 21% is £131 million a week coming into Britain for public services. You know, having a rate of 21% makes a big difference to protecting British businesses from being undercut by those few large multinationals who don't pay their fair share of tax. So from my point of view, you know, the job that we're doing in Parliament and that all of you are doing and the campaigns are doing more broadly is far from over. And we need to keep pushing the government to increase the ambition of what they're doing, because it's important, as I said, for two main reasons. One, it will bring in extra income, revenue for public services in this country. But secondly, and also really importantly, it will stop British businesses here who do pay their fair share of tax from being undercut by the few large multinationals who don't. And so one of the points I wanted to make was around what we can all do next. You know, I don't think we should see the G7 summit as being the end of the line. You know, this deal has to keep on going, it has to get through the G20, OECD, and so on. I think the pressure which has been put on by a broad coalition of people on the government over this has been really impressive. And it's really made, as I said at the beginning of my comments tonight, it's made an issue which could be really technical and hard to get your head around, really easy to understand and to understand the I guess the politics of, if you like, you know, to understand there is an issue of fairness here. There is a solution within grasp. You know, this is something which really annoys people and we can fix it. How, you know, you don't get that every day. So I think we all have a role now to play in continuing to push the government on this. You know, I think we shouldn't let them bluntly get away with some of their language, which I have to listen to in Parliament a lot, of saying, you know, we've done a deal and we're great. We need to say, well, thank goodness that some progress has been made, but you need to go a lot further. I'll just end by giving you a little taster of what I think the government's position is now, because I had a debate just yesterday where I raised it with the minister again about, you know, the government's position around this 15 versus 21%. And it was quite telling what the Exchequer Secretary said, because she came back and said, you know, we settled on 15% basically because it leaves, and I quote, appropriate room for countries to use corporation tax as a lever. Right. And if you unpack what that phrase means, it's basically, in my view, an admission that the government supported a lower rate because they had a desire to keep alive this possibility of a race to the bottom in future. And I think the message that we all have to send is that we don't want to continue with that race to the bottom. We want to call time on a race to the bottom. You know, we want to have fairness at the heart of a tax system, and you cannot have fairness if you have a few large multinationals both denying the revenue that we are owed to invest in our public services and undercutting those businesses in Britain who are playing by the rules. So it's been fantastic working with the Co-op Party on this. I know that the Co-op Party has been brilliant in terms of, really brilliant actually, in terms of clipping what I've said in Parliament and putting subtitles on it before I even get out of the chamber. That's, you know, you guys, brilliant service you've got, but it's really good. Hopefully a few of the words I use, you know, help to express the issue, but then promoting it amongst your members. I know you've done the petition, which has been really important to mobilize members. So as I say, I want to keep working with the Co-op, working with all the campaigners, working with civil society, using our role that as we can in Parliament to keep the pressure up and keep pushing for this ambitious global deal that, as I said, really is once in a generation.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm glad that I'll pass on your comments to our comms team about the speed of their video clipping. That's useful feedback. And I'm, you know, it's really great that we've got such strong advocates for the movement in Westminster and elsewhere. So thank you for everything you're doing, James. What I'm going to do is I would like to spotlight, in theory, I can spotlight all of us. There we go. Did that work? There, right. I am going to see if there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to make. So use the button at the bottom to pop your hand up or pop something in the chat. And Malcolm Wallace, always reliable to have a valid point to make. Over to you, please.
That's very kind of you. Just a brief comment. When the fair trade tax was launched in 2014, I tried to encourage Chelmsford Star Co-operative Society to get involved. And they declined because it was a little bit expensive. And I did try again a few years later at an AGM. However, at one of these meetings, one of the speakers said it wasn't quite like that, and there was a little bit of flexibility built in. So our party chair, who now happens to be the president of Chelmsford Star Co-operative Society, took it up again. And I'm delighted that last week on the Society's website, I saw the fair trade mark, and my Trades Council will be writing in congratulating the board for its decision. So absolutely good news.
Yeah,
You're pleased.
Yeah, we were really delighted to welcome Chelmsford Star Co-op on board. So well done to you and everyone else for, you know, for persistence. And, you know, I think it just shows the, you know, what can happen on the ground, those, you know, individuals just persisting to make a difference.
Right, fantastic. Are there other questions? Oh, we've got one from Philip Watson in the chat. Dear James, could you explain offshore tax havens like the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands and how much corporation tax is lost to the Exchequer?
Yeah, well, no, it's a really good point. And I think, you know, when you're thinking about tax havens and the way they operate today, I think we sort of probably mean two things, I guess. You know, we have our kind of classic example of a tax haven, which might be a smaller country where global companies, a few large multinationals sort of nominally headquarter themselves, and it's a very obvious way of avoiding tax. But then there's also a kind of broader issue here, which is around sometimes larger countries also engaging in a kind of race to the bottom in terms of their corporation tax rate. And what exactly you might call a tax haven, you know, do you count those countries who are cutting their corporation tax havens or not? I mean, it's a phrase. It depends what phrase you want to use, really. I think it's a spectrum of those smaller countries, which are your kind of classic idea of tax havens, versus other countries who are engaged in this race to the bottom. And I think what is so important about the global minimum corporate tax rate is that not only does it deal with potentially the kind of classic tax havens, if you like, but it also means that other countries are discouraged from engaging in that race to the bottom. It kind of calls time on that race to the bottom. I was reading something the other day where it said that, Britain had got into a habit of cutting its corporation tax so much, arguably you could call Britain a tax haven in some ways, so that kind of race to the bottom, I think, has been really pervasive in countries around the world. And so why this is so important, as well as dealing with the classic tax havens, is also sort of stopping that culture of a race to the bottom. That people see a way to compete and to encourage businesses to invest and to grow and so on is via cutting corporation tax, rather than all of the other benefits which countries can offer businesses to set up shop in their territories.
Did you want to add anything to that, Mary?
I guess only to say that sometimes we hear tax havens referred to as secrecy jurisdictions as well, and some of these places, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, that we see, it's also about, we cross over into issues of corruption. We saw a lot of the big data leaks over the last few years, the Panama Papers, and so they don't just facilitate tax avoidance but corruption as well. And it's so tax havens is one way that we refer to them, but some in the tax justice sector also look at the secrecy side of things as well. And do take a look at Tax Justice UK's website if this is something, and the Tax Justice Network, which produces an index on a ranking, in fact, of what they call secrecy jurisdictions, if that's something that you want to do a bit more research into.
Absolutely, and transparency is something that we talk a lot about at the Cooperative Party. You need to know what you're talking about to be able to hold it to account, and if you don't have that transparency, it's very hard to hold organisations accountable. I think coming back to sort of your work with councils, Mary, when we were thinking about looking into the private companies that own public utilities in the UK, trying to fit on one A4 page the ownership structure for Thames Water, for example, was incredibly difficult, because you've got so many subsidiaries and parent companies and umbrellas, and they're registered in different parts of the world, many of them in tax havens, and unpicking that to know which companies you can and can't trust, I guess, is so challenging, and where it's so important that there are sort of accreditation schemes and experts like both of you, Mary and James, to help us unpick some of the complications. I don't know if either of you could touch briefly on, where tax is part of the answer on transparency, but that there are other things we'll need to do to create fairness in the way that sort of especially multinational businesses run their affairs. I don't know if that's too mean a question that anyone would like to tackle.
I'm happy to take some of that. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we ask of all businesses that are accredited to the Fair Tax Mark is that they're transparent about who owns and controls them. So it's looking at where the money goes. It's called beneficial ownership, and we know that kind of non-disclosure of beneficial ownership is a way of kind of particularly where it's maybe rooted through tax havens, where it can be very, very, very hard. You've got shell companies or all kinds of complicated dealings going on. It can be really hard to get a kind of proper financial assessment of what's going on with a business. I mean, we saw a couple of years ago the collapse of care home provider Four Seasons, and they had really, really complex offshore ownership structures going on, with profits being shifted via kind of interest on loans, and it was all and we see how these kind of issues intersect between it's not just about how much tax you pay, it is very much about transparency. And so all the businesses that we have accredited to the Fair Tax Mark, they disclose their they disclose their ownership, so you can see clearly where, you know, where the money's going. And the other thing that we ask for is for multinational businesses is public country by country reporting. And again, this is the idea that you are reporting the profits and also the employees, where sales and employees where profits are made. So for instance, you know, if you have a business in the, you know, an arm in the Cayman Islands that's got millions going through it and one employee, you can see there's probably something, you know, something a bit dodgy going on there. And again, that's really something that tax justice campaigners are really pushing for. The UK has got legislation in place for public country by country reporting through the Finance Act, but it's not been enacted yet. Again, that position that, well, we'll do it when others do it. Well, the EU has now. So, you know, we want to be seeing movement on that. So it's not just reporting, you know, country by country about your sales and your employees, but also being public about that. And we've seen it work in banking. We know it can work.
Is there anything you wanted to add, James? Other bits of work you're doing around transparency and corporate behaviour?
Yeah, I mean, the bit particularly Mary mentioned around country by country reporting, I think is so important, because as Mary rightly highlighted, you know, public country by country reporting is already there in law. It just needs to be activated. And it's this, is the excuse I was talking about earlier of the government sort of saying that what appears to be the right thing, but then saying, but obviously we can't do it until other countries do it. They say, well, now other countries are starting to do it. So, you know, get on board. And I think, again, that's where we can put pressure on them around that, now that there is sort of a degree of public interest in the way that, you know, large multinationals are taxed. I think the other thing I would just flag in terms of a piece of work that we've been doing around transparency is around the Register of Overseas Entities, which has been repeatedly promised. So this is basically about if UK property is owned overseas, and you want like a register which would say who it is overseas ultimately owns that property, rather than it being through various shell companies and so on. And you know, this is another one where, you know, I think it was first mooted by David Cameron in 2015, I think, you know, and it's been going for years. And then the government said they will introduce it by 2021. In the Queen's speech, which just happened, there was no mention of the bill to introduce this. So unless they put a very strange parliamentary manoeuvre, I don't think they're going to get it into law in 2021. So, you know, that's another one where, I mean, there is a pattern here, right, of the government kind of feeling a bit of pressure, saying something to placate some of us who are trying to push them to act, but then letting it drop away and letting it drift off the radar. And I think that's where we all come in, to make sure that we push for the action to follow those words, or push for the words in the first place, but certainly push for the action if the words are forthcoming. And, you know, I think the Register of Overseas Entities Bill is a really good example of that, because all the work's been, well, a lot of the work has been done. You know, it's been looked at in draft, it's been evaluated by a committee, the government's considered responses, you know, a lot of work has gone into it, but it's just not becoming law. And that would have a big impact in terms of money laundering in particular, and then, you know, tax evasion and so on that can flow from that. So yes, I think there's plenty of aspects to this, to making the whole system fairer, and it really centres on transparency as an important thing, but also as a way of unlocking some of the other goals we want to achieve, if you like. You know, so country by country reporting, as Mary said, you need that information to then be able to charge them a fair rate of tax further down the line. So transparency really is a crucial part of this plan as well.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that you mentioned, James, was around that kind of perceived direction of travel of the government, that keeping the global rate low, they're being sort of not very transparent about their intentions there. We've been sort of being supportive of the work of Mary and the wider tax justice movement. It's something we care very much about. We're really pleased that, you know, there's been such amazing progress made, and grateful to Biden for helping to kick some of that off on a global scale. But where do you think that campaign needs to go next? Is it about that minimum rate, and how do we make that something which is engaging to people?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the minimum rate has to be at the heart of what we're pushing for now, because there is obviously a lot of detail as well that we need to get right. And for people who want to engage in all the detail, we should absolutely make sure the information is as accessible as possible so they can. But in terms of kind of capturing that, the big idea that's easy for an audience who isn't fully engaged in all the detail to lock into, I think this minimum rate is important. And I think it will make a really big difference. As I say, it is for two reasons. One, because it brings in more money to Britain, and we can invest that in public services, which is obviously a good thing. But the other is just making it more effective. Because if it is at 21%, it is more effective at stopping British businesses who pay their fair share of tax from being undercut. It is more effective at stopping that race to the bottom. It's a much stronger starting point for this to come from. And I think what I found really frustrating, not entirely surprising, but nonetheless frustrating, is that every time I've asked the government, they've basically said, well, I've asked them, what's your position on this? Why aren't you pushing for 21%? What is the British government's position going into these negotiations? They say, oh, well, it would be inappropriate to comment on our strategy, during negotiations. Or I think the phrase the minister used was, I'm not going to comment on our plans in flight. So the kind of the comeback that somehow they can't share their tactics with us. And I think, as people of this country, we should know the approach our government is taking in negotiations. There might be certain details which, okay, if things are really live, they're changing very quickly, but it's now out in public. There's a communique from the G7 summit. I really think we should be able to know what our government was pushing for, so that we know how to push them. We know, but so that we have a clear evidence that they need to be pushed in a better direction in the future.
You're right. I add on where you see this campaign going next and where you're going to be focusing your efforts.
Sorry, Anna, I lost you shortly. Was that to me?
It was just, what next with Fair Tax Foundation's work on this area? Are you sort of in line with where James is? Is there anything you'd like us to ask our members to do? How can we make it engaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about keeping the pressure up, keeping asking those questions. I mean, the headline rate is, as James said, that's really important. And we were looking at 21%. That's what Biden put on the table, perhaps thinking it would probably thinking it would be lowered, and it's gone down to 15. And so it is about keeping the pressure up on that. On that headline rate, but it's also about looking at the loopholes. So I spoke briefly about is Amazon going to be captured? And we know that Amazon, their retail arm, has a pretty low profit margin, but Amazon Web Services has got a big profit margin. You lump them both in together and they don't get captured. So it's looking at like really techie things that really matter, like that as campaigners we need to be looking at, that's called segmentation, looking at different bits of a business to make sure that the profitable bits are captured. But I think it's coming back to people, tax is complicated, but people, it's not that people don't understand when they're when things are unfair. We can see it, and people can tell, and the public can see what's going on. We can see it in our high streets. We can see domestic businesses struggling to compete, and people know that, and they want to see action. Our polling at the Fair Tax Foundation shows us that 2/3 of the public would rather shop with or work for a business that pays its fair share of tax. People want this stuff to happen, and it kind of that kind of goes right across the political spectrum as well. So it's something that all parties should be working hard on and pushing forward. So it's something that we just need to keep the pressure up on. And I think James is right. This is a once in a generation. Just this time last year, when Trump was still in power, we were wondering what on earth was going to happen with multinational tax reform. Was it ever going to happen? And suddenly we are in a completely different place, and we have to push now. And now is the time to see this change happen.
No,
So it's exciting. It's great.
is
It's a positive
exciting.
thing. Something to be excited
It's
about.
very exciting,
Definitely.
and
Yeah.
you know, we talk about tax being complicated, but we did some polling too, showing that actually when you break down what Biden's plans are, the vast majority of people support them, and that there's sort of widespread belief that in order to be seen as a global leader and on a world stage, and in order to be trusted, credible on the economy, we do need to be stepping up and playing a leadership role in corporation tax. So I think that's so critical. I've got a hand up from Ian and then a comment from Gary, and then I think I'm going to let people enjoy what I think is going to turn into a thunderstorm soon. So Ian, do you want to jump in quickly?
Just very quickly, and thanks to the speakers, they've been really good, God, really educational. What number is acceptable in the negotiations? So we're at 15%, we want 21. Is there a figure that's acceptable, or do you think it might just stay at 15, or what's your view on that? Where do you think we'll end up?
Nice question. Put a number on it, guys. If you can. I mean, I'm gonna, I don't know, back Biden and
Well, it's
say
tricky,
21 seems good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
football.
We were supportive of the 20. We want to see, we say, look, I mean, we say we want to see a substantial rate. You know, we want to see more than 15%, you know, and it's, you know, like I said, it's not just about the rate, it's about how those calculations are worked out, you know, having a fair seat at the table for developing countries as well. So there's a lot in, you know, there's a lot in the detail as well, but yeah. We say substantial. You know, one thing we've seen the UK say, you know, UK government say that corporation tax will go up to 25% in 2 years' time. So, you know, we've got to keep our eye on the things happening domestically as well. So, yeah, good question.
James, is there a number that you guys are working to?
Yeah, well, I mean, the sort of fault line in the fight in Parliament has been between 21 and 15%, because, you know, when 21% came forward from Biden, I think people thought, okay, that's a decent, you know, starting point for these negotiations and so on. I didn't think we thought the starting point would then go down to 15. You know, that was disappointing when we saw that happen. Really disappointing. I know the language was carefully phrased, saying at least 15%, which was, you know, probably someone in the US Treasury holding out hope that we can get it back up. But, you know, it was a blow. It was a blow to the process, really, to see it go from 21 to 15. And, you know, it happened, I'm trying to remember the exact date when they announced it now, but I remember it was just after they had some OECD negotiations about it, where they had 24 countries and all the different representatives there. And, you know, at that time you had obviously America 21%, you had the other G7 nations, all of whom had indicated their support for the 21%. The only country not to was Britain. And, you know, what the UK says at these international negotiations really matters. You know, it really has an impact, because if all the countries think, well, Britain's not going to sign up to it, you know, it creates that space to then water it down. And that's exactly what's happened. You know, and that's, I think, what made us so annoyed and so disappointed, in that it was there, you know, ready to be grasped. And, you know, obviously I haven't seen the minutes of the meeting, but I suspect in large part due to our reticence and our lukewarmness, and our as a country lukewarmness, indicating that, you know, the British government would rather it were lower, that helped it to slide down to 15. As I say, the challenge now is to keep up the pressure, try and get it back up, but it was a blow.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think they announced it during half term, which I thought was especially mean. But the final bit I'll say, sort of thinking a bit about individual actions. Mary has mentioned the fair tax motion that councils can pass. So I know that a number of you on this call are councillors, or thinking of standing to be councillors, or previous candidates, or you work closely with your local councillors. So take that as your action today to find out whether your local council is one of the signatories, and if not, why not, and when they're going to sign up. The other thing we can all do today is sort of put our money where our mouth is. I'll pop in the chat. This is the list of accredited organisations, and this links into Gary's comment asking whether fair tax has a logo. for businesses to display in their windows. So have a look on the accredited organisations. If you think that they could be shouting even more about the fact that they're Fair Tax Mark accredited, I'm sure that's something that Mary and the team would love to work with you on. And if there are businesses locally that you think should be accredited and they aren't, I'm sure that anything you can do to help push them over the line would be greatly appreciated. But supporting those organisations like Mid-Counties and Revolver and all of the great, obviously the Co-op Party, Unicorn, all of those great organisations that have signed up for accreditation, and making sure that you're rewarding sort of good corporate behaviour in the way that you spend your money is a small action all of us can take in our daily lives. So on that, I'm going to thank James and Mary a huge amount for giving up their sticky summer evening. We're really appreciative of your time now, but also all of the time you spend on the issues that matter to us every day. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who has come along, listened, watched, been involved in this movement, signed petitions, gotten involved, because actually we have seen a massive shift in the UK, and it's you know, credit has to go obviously to those people who've been plugging away at this for a long time, but also to the ordinary people, and within that I include lots of our members and supporters who put their names on petitions, who lobby their MPs, who get involved and demonstrate that it's not just a small number of policy wonks we all care about, and that needs to happen sooner rather than later. So thank you everybody for your interest, and have a lovely evening. Look after yourselves.
Enjoy the rain, hey?
Not here in Manchester, apparently. Thanks
Bye,
ever so
everybody.
much. It's been a
Thanks for having
pleasure.
me.
Bye bye, everybody.